security and of India's military modernization. So please join me in welcoming Manjeet. Very happy to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for the very kind introduction. Before I say anything, I just want to preface by noting that my connection is a little bit spotty, so I apologize in advance for that. But I really want to thank Patrick Kjolner and the Franco-German Observatory for inviting me to deliver this talk. It's wonderful to talk to you from here in Hamburg. I guess I will speak for about 25 minutes or so. And the way we've set up is my colleague Lisa Boyko will be sharing my slides on my behalf. So we have a bit of a tech issue going on there. So Lisa, if you could please share the slides. Thank you very much. As Miriam mentioned, this project is a part of a joint co-authored project that I've undertaken with Amitav Acharya from American University in Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. So Amitav and I have a book coming forth with Yale University Press. And the book actually talks about this project writ large from a theoretical and a historical perspective and looks at the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean in comparison. We also have a book chapter that kind of summarizes some of the core points of this book. And I will be talking to you, my presentation will be based both on the forthcoming book and the book chapter in question. Next slide, please. So the basic question driving our research is what comes after American hegemony? And obviously, a bunch of scholars have taken a look at this question, have contributed to answering this question. So we will provide our own take on this. So one of the most prominent liberal IR scholars, John Eikenberry, has argued that after American liberal hegemony, we will be in for less desirable alternatives familiar from history, including rivalries and regional blocs and so on and so forth. And in other words, Eikenberry's argument is one of liberal hegemony. But realist scholars also have made a similar argument based on hegemony, Pax Americana being a successor of Pax Britannica and so on in the Kilpinian tradition. My larger point here is that both in the realist and some liberal variants of IR theory, hegemony itself is seen as a view, hegemony itself is seen as order. And therefore, the passing of American hegemony is either said to lead to disorder, which is considered obviously a problem because it's a binary, hegemony versus non-hegemony. Or in the worst case, it is feared that it might be replaced by Chinese hegemony, which nobody seems to want. So what do we think of order when we are not thinking about hegemony? We tend to think of order in terms of polarity. So next slide, please. So when it comes to polarity, there are multiple views out there. Recently, some scholars have argued that after the passing of American unipolarity / hegemony, we are going to be in for a bipolar world with the United States and China as two poles. And that's what is Tunsio's argument. But other prominent international historians whom IR scholars read very closely, like Paul Kennedy, have argued that American unipolarity or dominance, if you like, is giving way to a world of multipolarity with at least 6 great powers, including the U.S. and China, of course, but also the EU, Japan, Russia, and India. In other words, polarity scholars can't seem to agree whether the future will be bipolar or multipolar. At the same time, another prominent polarity scholar, William Wolford, who has earlier written about the stability of a unipolarity world, has even gone on to argue that polarity matters less today than in the past. In other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is that one version of order is hegemony by one single power. The other version of order is by a polar distribution of powers, whether two or more. But there seems to be no consensus either way. Next slide, please. And the third big point that I wish to mention at the start is when people talk about order, it's not always clear whether they are talking about the global level or whether they are talking about the regional level. And I just want to preface by a couple of points. The first one being that the liberal international order, or American liberal hegemony, if you like, was never really global to begin with, because in the Cold War, for example, we had a bipolar world in the first place. And in the post-Cold War period, the American order was closed, whether partially or wholly, to rivals and recalcitrant states. In fact, Henry Kissinger has even gone on to argue that a global world order has never really existed. And more recently, Evelyn Goh has argued that any understanding of order needs to capture in more actors, factors, and vectors than polarity, whether uni or multi can actually capture. So my larger point, along with Amitav, is that regions matter. And this regional dimension will be very important for our understanding. Next slide, please. So our argument is that a multiplex order or a multi-regional world order is in the process of making. And here are some key characteristics that I will be talking about. First of all, this emerging order will be neither hegemonic, whether American or Chinese, nor will it be simply multipolar, although it will certainly be multipolar. In fact, it will be more than multipolar. It will be multiplex. And in this multiplex world order, regions will matter. It will be regions that will be the building blocks of the world order, not poles per se. And in this emerging world order, there will be no single idea that will dominate, whether liberal or otherwise. And in such an order, regions and the lesser powers, if you like, the non-great powers, if you like, will legitimize orders at the regional level. So that's the core argument, but I will go into some of the details as the presentation proceeds. Next slide, please. So the central argument from a more conceptual point of view is that in the hegemonic and in the polarity vision, order is top-down. It is built by the great powers. Whereas what we are arguing is that order is an accretion of multitudes of local and regional initiatives. In other words, this is not a hegemonic-centered order. It's not a great power-centered order. And since the lesser powers matter, it, by definition, is a decentered order. At the same time, while we are emphasizing regions, what I wish to also emphasize is that our regions are not closed. We are not talking about spheres of influence, and we are not talking about self-contained regional worlds. Our regions are interconnected, and therefore this is an open order. And that's why my earlier point about this being a multi-regional world order. Of course, for the purposes of this presentation, I will focus on the Indo-Pacific, but I'll try to make a point about the connections, as you will see. In the context of the Indo-Pacific in particular, the larger point is that the greater and the lesser powers will shape it together. Ideas matter, and this is a system of shared management, not hegemonic management of international orders. Next slide, please. So given this larger context and the larger argument that I'm trying to make, this is how my presentation is structured. I'll first talk a little bit about the Sino-American rivalry, and my larger point here is that this is not a rivalry about competing hegemonies. Next, in the next three sections, I'll talk briefly about the American, the Chinese, and the Southeast Asian approaches to the Indo-Pacific. And in that context, I will try to make the case for this non-hegemonic multiplex order that I've just described. Next slide, please. So in the context of the Sino-American strategic rivalry, so at the end of the Cold War, when the United States emerged as a unipole, as early as 1992, the Pentagon's draft plan, which was leaked to the New York Times, actually quoted this, what I have for you here on the slides. And I am reading within quotes, "We must maintain the mechanism for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role. The point that I'm trying to make is that the Americans wanted to continue their dominance / their unipolarity / their hegemony in perpetuity. That was the wish / dream / strategy, if you like, beginning in the early 1990s. And scholars have, of course, as I mentioned earlier, looked at this period as one of unipolarity or dominance or hegemony, if you like. But more recently, in the context of the phenomenal rise of China, many scholars have begun to refer to at least parts of maritime Asia as contested zones where America's hegemony no longer prevails. And of course, China's anti-access area denial capabilities have played a key role in this process of attenuating American hegemony. And of course, the other features thereof are the building and militarization of artificial islands by the Chinese. And the general prognosis is that the Chinese will have increasing capabilities to fight at greater distances from the Chinese coast in any contest with the United States. So in other words, American hegemony is passé, and that's the larger point that I wish to make. Next slide, please. So American hegemony has gone, but can a hegemonic order re-emerge, whether American or Chinese? And my larger point is no. American hegemony is unlikely to re-emerge unless and until China falters. And people have been talking about China faltering since 1949. So that's obviously not a safe bet to make. At the same point, I'll try to show that while China is certainly rising, China is not going to become hegemonic. So in the context of American hegemony being attenuated, many of America's leading scholars, including military historians, tend to think that America cannot impose a military blockade or a naval blockade, if you like, of China in circumstances other than a global war. And of course, a global war will also have a nuclear component. So for all practical purposes, America is unlikely to be hegemonic in the face of a rising China. But at the same time, a rising China itself is not going to become hegemonic because, and I will show you the next slide. In the next slide, I will show you the map of maritime Southeast Asia in particular. But the larger point is that in the Indo-Pacific, for China to be able to dominate this space, China has to dominate both maritime East Asia and the Indian Ocean. And many Chinese strategists feel that China's dominance of this larger space is unlikely unless both the Americans and the Indians were to decline or make major mistakes. And this does not seem to be very probable, and not at the same time, at least. So in that sense, China is also unlikely to emerge as hegemonic. Next slide, please. And as you can see from this map of maritime Asia, there are three basic straits that connect maritime East Asia with the Indian Ocean: Malacca, Sunda, and Lombok. So they're very narrow choke points, and not all of these states are, so to speak, in China's pocket. And China is going to have the issue of distance and the narrowness of the choke points of the straits that travels through maritime Southeast Asia. So China is unlikely to become hegemonic as a consequence, even though China will certainly become more powerful as time goes on. And in any case, China seems to have what Rosemary Foote has called a restricted constituency of support. There are not many states advocating Chinese hegemony, whether in the region or beyond. Next slide, please. So in other words, the Sino-American strategic rivalry is not about hegemony versus counter-hegemony, and this is not about hegemonic succession either. So what is it really about? In my opinion, it's about two things. The first thing is prestige and status at the apex of the international system. In other words, this is a rivalry about pecking orders. Who's number one? And of course, Trump, Biden, Xi have all made statements that have alluded to their own visions of primacy or number one status for their own countries. But as scholars like Stephen Wertheim have mentioned, America, in fact, seems to have been pursuing primacy as not as a strategy, but as an identity, at least since the end of the Second World War. So it's in that context, keeping in mind the fact that the Chinese also have these visions of overturning the century of humiliation and recreating what they think was a past era of China's greatness in the world. So it's this contest of prestige and status that is at the root of the Sino-American rivalry, which will be fought in the realms of economics, technology, and positioning in the Indo-Pacific. So I'll talk, of course, about the Indo-Pacific dimension for the purposes of this presentation. Next slide, please. So the first dimension, of course, is position and prestige. Like I mentioned, the second dimension is geopolitics of access, because clearly China's military rise has attenuated American dominance because of these contested zones that I mentioned. So the Americans are seeking the ability to fight near China's shores to the degree that it's possible. The Americans want access in that part of the world, if you like, or capabilities to be able to fight there, if you like. Similarly, the Chinese do feel vulnerable because of the narrow Southeast Asian choke points to reach out to the wider Indo-Pacific space. So the Chinese are also seeking the ability to project their power and therefore access distant parts of maritime Asia and the Indian Ocean. So in other words, the way I see it, this is about naval power projection by the United States and by China. This is not about hegemony over trade routes in and of itself. Power projection does not imply hegemony. It simply implies the ability to protect your own interests along distant routes. So it's about the geopolitics of access. Next slide, please. So given this larger context of these two dimensions of primacy and geopolitics of access, America's approach towards the Indo-Pacific has three strands. The American strategy, that is. The first strand has to do with the transformation of America's Cold War hub and spoke network of alliances, if you like, in East Asia into what scholars are increasingly referring to as networks and patchworks. Of course, in this context, we know that the United States has deepened its alliances with both Japan and Australia and is forming new relationships with places like Vietnam and India and so on. The Quad being a very important example, if you like, of this more patchworked, networked approach. At the same time, America's allies and partners are also creating links between themselves. For example, Japan's closest security partner now, after the United States, is, of course, Australia. And Australians are upping their relationship with India, and the Indians are upping their relationship with the Japanese, and so on and so forth. So that's one dimension. The other dimension of America's strategy towards the Indo-Pacific is promoting the rise of India itself. And both under the Biden and previously under the Trump administrations, this has been a part of their respective Indo-Pacific strategies itself. Both these presidencies, at least in their official statements, wanted India to take, quote unquote, the leading role in the Indian Ocean. And at the same time, the U.S. has been a promoter of India's closer relationship with the Southeast Asia, which, as we know, is in the process of being made, rather, although rather slowly than many perhaps desire. The third component of America's strategy towards this part of the world, the Indo-Pacific, if you like, is to include actors from outside of what we normally think of the Indo-Pacific. And that's my other point about a multi-regional world order is in the making, no closed spheres of influence. The Indo-Pacific will be connected to other parts of the world. In this case, with Europe, for example, the Biden Indo-Pacific strategy specifically talks about promoting links between the Europeans and NATO on the one hand, and the Indo-Pacific on the other. So my larger point here is when you think about America's approach towards the Indo-Pacific in terms of promoting the rise of a new great power, India, and including other great powers, if you like, whether the Europeans or the British and the French and so on, actually a multipolar plus world order is in the making in the Indo-Pacific, which will itself be connected to other parts of the world, in this case, Europe. Next slide, please. Likewise, the Chinese, given this larger background, seem to be having a three-pronged approach to this Indo-Pacific space. Of course, we know that the Chinese don't use the term Indo-Pacific, but the Chinese are certainly trying to emerge as a naval power in both the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific itself. And while China has certainly militarized the artificial islands that were created and is creating power projection capabilities, China is not putting all of its eggs in the maritime basket. So the first component of China's strategy is, of course, building continental bridges, because these maritime routes, America and America's allies and friends remain pretty powerful. The Chinese are seeking other alternatives, which also goes to show that the Chinese, in fact, are not seeking hegemony. And these alternative routes are continental corridors via Myanmar and Pakistan in particular towards the greater Indian Ocean region. We know that gas and oil pipelines from Myanmar into China have already been operational since 2013, 2014. Of course, I don't want to oversell this point, because China still relies on the high seas and the Strait of Malacca. But my point here simply is that because China does feel vulnerable to American potential blockade, China is not putting all its eggs in the maritime basket. The other component of China's strategy is, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's quite interesting that in the maritime space, the Belt and Road Initiative is often sold as China plus ASEAN plus X model. X could mean South Asia, X could mean the South Pacific, X could mean East Africa, X could mean the Middle East, and so on and so forth. And just like the United States, my point here is that the Chinese have their own version of open regionalism. In other words, China itself is not seeking a closed sphere of influence. And in that sense, the Indo-Pacific will be connected to other parts of the world. And the third component of China's strategy is China is also building its own minilaterals, just like the US is building its own minilaterals, if you like, in the form of the Quad and so on. So for China, the Lancang-Mekong cooperation mechanism is the first China-built Southeast Asian minilateral, which of course looks at non-traditional security issues. But it should be noted that China does engage in joint riverine patrols with some of these Lancang-Mekong cooperation mechanism states. And the Biden Indo-Pacific strategy specifically refers to extraterritorial riverine patrols as challenging what America thinks is a rules-based international order. But my point, again, to emphasize is that China's own approach, just like America's own approach, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is also pointing towards a diffused structure which is connected to other parts of the world. And it's not going to be a closed/hegemonic space. Next slide, please. But that's for China and the United States. And my larger point is that Southeast Asia, the region, if you like, that connects the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, is not really just an order taker living in a world made by the great powers. Southeast Asians in particular are actively shaping the region, and they are actively shaping the region through their ideational agency above all. And this ideational agency of Southeast Asia has two components. The first component, and they're interconnected, of course. The first component is Southeast Asia rejects hegemony as a concept. Hegemony, whether of the United States or of China or indeed of any other power. And the other ideational component in Southeast Asia's approach is a rejection of a choice, if you like, between the United States and China. The feeling in Southeast Asia is that America can easily be distracted, a war in Ukraine, another war in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. So America needs to be, in that sense, kept engaged, and America needs to be kept within the region. America needs to be kept within the region simply because China can be a bully, and many Southeast Asian states have seen that in the context of China's more heavy-handed approach, if you like, in the South China Sea, for example. At the same time, they think that China cannot be kept out because China is right next to Southeast Asia. So I think the best summation of Southeast, in my opinion at least, the best summation of Southeast Asia's approach towards the great powers can be captured by the Australian historian Martin Stewart Fox's understanding of the dynamic going on. And I kind of want to read this quote because it's very interesting. Martin Stewart Fox says, the Southeast Asian states want the United States to remain a powerful presence in the region, serving as a balancing force vis-a-vis China in the regional power equation, and have made this known. But they do not want to be a part of any balance of power coalition themselves alongside the United States against China. And at the same time, they also want to make room for China. In other words, Southeast Asia is actively shaping the regional order. Next slide, please. So Southeast Asia's approach also has a three-pronged strategy. The first component of Southeast Asia's approach is, as many scholars have alluded to in the past as well, including Evelyn Goh, whom I mentioned earlier, that it's Southeast Asia that is managing the great powers, or at least trying to manage the great powers, rather than simply being managed, if you like, by the hegemons or by the great powers. And here, of course, we know that the regional institutions have been supplied by Southeast Asia / ASEAN itself. At the same time, Southeast Asian states are also shaping the discourse on the Indo-Pacific. So, for example, the American approach towards the Indo-Pacific often refers to free. And this freedom, this free term is often associated with democracy, and therefore is implied, or is rather understood as implying the exclusion of China, whereas the Southeast Asians don't want that. So they don't use the term free in their own discourse on the Indo-Pacific. They use terms like open and inclusive. And this openness, of course, is important because they want this region to remain open and engaged with other parts of the world, a point that I've been trying to make. The second prong of Southeast Asia's approach is Southeast Asia is also building minilaterals other than ASEAN, if you like. They have that, just like the U.S. and China building minilaterals two on the slide here. The first one being the Malacca Strait Patrol of those 4 states, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand. That includes coordinated naval and air patrols as well as intelligence sharing. I should also note that the Malacca Strait Patrols allow these countries hot pursuit rights up to 5 nautical miles within the territory of these other states. So this is a very important dimension of cooperation. More importantly, these regional states took the creation of Malacca Straits Patrol seriously because they thought if they did not look after this very important Malacca choke point themselves, the Americans or the Chinese might wish to do so. So they are providing regional security. And of course, the Americans and the Chinese are supportive of their initiatives. Similarly, there is another regional minilateral, the Sulu-Sulawesi Sea Patrol of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, which is modeled after the Malacca Strait Patrols, and it's rather similar, except for the fact that it does not allow hot pursuit into the waters of other states. And the third component of Southeast Asia's approach towards the region is that Southeast Asia is also actively engaging with India. In fact, as early as 2005, Singapore's Goh Chok Tong, even before the term Indo-Pacific had been coined, had mentioned that India's slow and gradual rise and China's entry into the Indian Ocean meant that East Asia and South Asia were no longer distinct theaters. They were slowly in the process of diffusing. So in the context of a greater Indian role in the region, which is slowly in the making, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Thailand conduct coordinated patrols with the Indian Navy. And of course, that has implications, if you like, for access into the Strait of Malacca, the mouth of the Strait of Malacca, if you like. And the Indian Navy also has naval logistics agreements with Vietnam and Singapore and so on. So my larger point is, next slide, please. So my larger point is that the passing of American hegemony is actually not producing disorder. contrary to conventional wisdom. Many people tend to think, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, like Icahn Berry, who mentioned that the passing of liberal hegemony was going to create, a world of disorder. And in the hegemonic stability paradigm, clearly it is implied that the absence of a hegemon would create disorder. Whereas what I'm trying to argue along with Amitav in this paper, in this book, is that the passing of American hegemony is in fact producing more governance, not less. So just as a recap, the Malacca Straits patrols, the Sulu-Sulawesi Sea patrols, what China is doing, the Lancang Mekong riverine patrols, what the United States is doing with the Quad and whatever else. The point is that a more diffused, patchworked order, which is connected to other parts of the world, is in the making. In fact, we now have more governance, not just hegemonic governance, not less. Next slide, please. And that's and this is my final slide. And my larger point simply is that unlike the hegemonic and polarity-based theories that talk about a top-down building of international order, local initiative can also make and shape orders. Southeast Asian states in particular, by rejecting hegemony and by rejecting choice, are promoting a new paradigm entirely. Of course, in this version, the great powers do matter and they are doing their own thing, but the so-called non-great powers also matter, and their ideational agency is having a major impact on the structure and the shape and the ideas governing the regional space, which of course rejects Pax hegemonia. And while I did not talk about history in my presentation today, but I did mention at the start of the presentation that this is based on my forthcoming book project with Amitav, where we compare the Roman Mediterranean with classical Southeast Asia. And their argument is that the whole hegemonic great power management paradigm of IR theory comes from the Greco-Roman paradigm in the Mediterranean, whereas classical Southeast Asia, historically in the pre-European period, never really had a hegemon. And I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A if there are questions. But just to quickly sum it up, shared management by both the great powers and the lesser powers is in the making in this part of the world, which will remain interconnected with other parts of the world. So in other words, the passing of American hegemony does not imply hegemonic succession. And in that sense, the United States is going to be the last naval superpower to control the maritime geopolitical space, at least in Asia. Thank you very much.
Maybe I'll pass the final word back to you, David, with the announcement of our next session.
So I'd like to announce the next webinar, which will be organized by the CIRI in September. We haven't quite fixed the date. And we'll have as our speaker Professor Kwek Cheng Chui of the University Kebangsaan Malaysia, the Malaysian National University from IKSMAT. And the tentative title, I hasn't approved it yet, is "Why Isn't the Indo-Pacific Halal for Malaysia?" Why isn't the Indo-Pacific halal for Malaysia? Question mark. Look forward to seeing you all then.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much to David. Thank you very much, above all, to Manjit for a very super interesting talk. Thanks to all the questions asked and all the attendees. And we hope to see you at our next event.